Okay, so now we're going to focus on estimation of manufacturing cost. As a reminder, we were discussing the topic of economics and optimization. Remember that this process is happens simultaneously, right? We're constantly designing the plan. We are after that we evaluate preliminarily the fixed capital investment and the cost of manufacturing. We also evaluate profitability, and then we go back at any of the stages to do any optimization. So previously, we were talking about the fixed capital investment. Remember that the fixed capital investment is an expense, right? It's an expense that is invested or one time, right? It's an investment that happened one time at the beginning, right? For the design, construction, and the startup of a new chemical plant, or a revamp of an existing plan, right? An extension of something that is already in place. Depending on the type of battery limits or the type of plan, right? If it's a startup or is a revamp, we can calculate the total cost, the total module cost, or we can calculate the grassroots cost, right? Depending on the battery limits and the boundaries of our analysis. Now, the cost of manufacturing, right, deals more with, is a kind of like a measurements of the day-to-day activities for acquiring, transforming, and distributing materials, parts, and finishing goods, right? So a good example is, this is what you operate, right? The money that you need to operate your house every month, every year, not necessarily the equipment that you buy to make your house livable. Cost of manufacturing are costs expressed in units of dollars per unit of time, in contrast to the capital cost, which is expressed in terms of dollars. So now we're talking about time, right, as a base, right, for our calculations. We need to have the process information provided by the process flow diagram. We need to estimate the fixed capital investment before we do the cost of manufacturing, because we're going to see that the fixed capital investment is kind of like give you a sense of the scale of the process, how big it is, right? And that will affect, right, the estimation of some of the costs associated with the manufacturing of the product. Also, you need an estimate of the number of operators required to operate the plant, and I will go through some examples to show you how this is done. There are two main factors affecting the cost of manufacturing. First one is the direct manufacturing cost, and these are all the costs associated to operate the plant, or prime costs, right? So the most important things that we need to operate the activities of the plant. And then there's indirect cost of manufacturing, basically non-production costs or overheads, and this includes the fixed manufacturing costs and the general expenses. These terms may change depending on the reference that you're using, but basically you need to understand there are things that are directly related to the process and things that are needed but not necessarily directed to the process. So the direct manufacturing cost represents the operating expenses that vary with production rate. When product demand drops, production rate is reduced to less than the design capacity, so we need to take into consideration the specifications for the plan. At this lower rate, we would expect a reduction in the factors making up the direct manufacturing cost. These reductions may be directly proportional to the production rate, for example, raw materials and utilities, or may be reduced slightly, for example, maintenance and operating labor. It doesn't matter the scale of the process. We may need to still pay the operators to continue, right, operating the units that we have in the process. However, if we change the scale, therefore the target amount of the product may be reduced. Therefore, other utilities like raw materials may also be reduced. So the direct manufacturing cost includes different categories. You have raw materials, cost of chemical feedstock required by process flow rate obtained from the process flow diagram. Also include the waste treatment. This is the cost associated with waste treatment to protect the environment. We also have utilities. Within the utilities, we have fuel gas, electric power, steam, cooling water, processed water, boiler, feed water, instrument air, inert gas, refrigeration, or any other type of things that we need in terms of utility. Like, for example, maybe you need to add some particular molecule into the process, or maybe you need to consider the catalyst, right, cost to make sure that the process happens. Also, you need to consider the operating labor, and this is the cost of personnel required for plant operations. You may have different type of operators in the plant, so you need to consider those. different supervisory and clerical labor. Here is the cost of administrative, engineering, and support personnel, particularly making the process happen, right? That particular process that you're designing. Also, the maintenance and repairs. Here is the cost of labor and materials associated with maintenance. The operating supply, like miscellaneous supply that support daily operations, not considered to be raw materials. This is an example of catalyst and also benzene if you're using it for extraction or something like that. You put it here, not on the utilities, I'm sorry. And then you have the laboratory charges. These are costs of routine and special laboratory tests required for production quality control and troubleshooting. Many companies, they already have in place a QA, quality control assurance lab, to make sure that these expenses are maintained within the company with their employees, or you can outsource this, right, and pay for the service. And lastly, you have patents and royalties, and this is the cost of using a patented or licensed technology, and these are very common, for example, for the pharma industry, that they need to have a license for to avoid competitors, right, like people that do the same molecule and sell it under a different brand. You also have, in terms of the indirect cost of manufacturing, you can have the fixed manufacturing costs, and this involve criteria or categories that are independent of the change in production rate. They include property taxes, insurance, and depreciation, which are charged at constant rates even when the plant is not in operation. You have, for example, depreciation, like I mentioned, right, the cost associated with the physical plant, legal operating expenses for tax purposes. You will see we will include the depreciation on the side when we do the profitability analysis, and the reason is because that is a value that does depend on the law. So the law changes, therefore the depreciation changes. So you typically include that on the side or apart from this analysis. I'm going to show you that in a moment. You can also include here the local taxes and insurances, the costs associated with property taxes and liability in insurance based on plant location and severity of the process. So this is important, right? When you consider this, particularly the type of chemical plant and the location, the changes with if it's state taxes or federal taxes. Plant overhead costs, sometimes considered factory expenses. Cash all costs associated with operations of auxiliary facilities supporting the manufacturing process. Costs involve payroll and accounting services, fire protection and safety services, medical services, cafeteria and any recreation facilities, payroll overhead and employee benefits, general engineering, etc. Then the other thing that we can include right within the indirect manufacturing cost is the general expenses. They represent an overhead burden that is necessary to carry out business function, such as management, sales, financing, and research functions. They're seldom varied with production level. However, items such as research and development and distribution and selling costs may be decreased if extended periods of low production levels occur. In the indirect manufacturing costs, as I mentioned before, right, we have administration costs, and this is the cost for administration, includes salaries, other administration, buildings, and other related activities. Distribution and selling. Cost of sales, marketing required to sell the chemical products include salaries and other miscellaneous costs. Remember that all of this salary that are in administration is not directly related to the process. So these are not the salaries for the engineers or operators. This is for the business to operate, right, as a company. And then you have research and development. These are the costs of research activities related to process and products, include salaries and funds for research related equipment and supplies. This general expenses is where companies sometimes decide to cut off and lay off personnel. Particularly, there's many companies when they are in a very susceptible financial condition, they typically, the first thing that they do is that they close their research and development. So that have the consequence of you not being, a leader in the market, but at least is saving some money until the company gets better. So in terms of the overall relationship of this type of cost, right, we have a cost structure. This is just an example on how to summarize the cost structure. You have the prime cost, or the direct cost, basically all the costs associated to operate the design that you put on HISES, so you're trying to build in the company. You have the factory cost, Those are basic costs necessary to produce a level of output. They are commonly related to a specific facility allocated the production of the output, depending on the output, of course. And the output is the product, right? The desired product. The total costs, these are costs may not necessarily apply to a specific location, but could be assumed by the whole corporation, particularly if this corporation is a multinational. R&D could, for instance, take place in a separate facility, and the administrative and sales costs incurred by the head office are supported by the whole corporate network. Things are very common, like, for example, Abbott or Eli Lilly or Pharma, they have their headquarters of R&D located, let's say, in Cincinnati, and then what they have in the different plants, for example, in Puerto Rico, they had one, right? Typically, Puerto Rico was focused on manufacturing, and the R&D was located in Cincinnati, or the mainland, like we call it, right? So you have to take into consideration that, right, when you're actually doing the final costing of your chemical plant. You may not need to include this if you're a part of a multinational. Then the last part, right, is from this information, what we try to get is the profit. So in the profit, we have the price. So there's two differences, right, between the price and the net selling price. So the price is a monetary equivalent paid by the purchaser of the output, and is commonly set by contract or by current market values. However, the net selling price includes the total cost of the manufacturer and the profit it is willing to take. This price does not include taxes that are usually levied and added value or profit. Okay, so it is important that we know the difference between the two, especially when we start working with profitability analysis. I want to mention before I move on is that the effect of globalization. So when we have international transactions, various commercial terms can apply in terms of who assumes the distribution costs and the liabilities while the cargo is in transit. With globalization, distribution is taking growing importance in the manufacturing cost structure, even if logistics costs have not changed much due to improvements in freight distribution. We are not going to take into consideration globalization, but if you are in these big companies, you may need to talk, right, with somebody to know how to include this cost associated with the globalization, right, and the market in a global level. So this is just the final thing, right, is showing you that the manufacturing cost structure does depend on the type of industry. So here on the left side, you have a cost structure of chemical industry as for June 28, 2018. And then on the right side, you have the cost structure of the healthcare sector. So notice, right, that for the chemical industry, even within the chemical industries, we have variations. Look at the chemical process wholesaling versus the chemical product manufacturing. Notice that, right, the costs associated with purchases, wages, depreciation, utilities, rent, and profit does vary depending on the chemical industry. Notice here on the healthcare sector, right, you have the hospital, general medical practices, residential nursing, that here the wages are more, right? So on the left side, our type of industry, we're more concerned with buying equipment, right? The purchasing of the raw materials also, and the in this case, right, the utilities, you can see that has also a big percent. But here in the healthcare sector, where it's more people, right, working to provide the service to the customer, you can see a really large wages. So this is just so you compare, you can see that the cost structure depends not on the type of industry that you are in.